When planting out your garden, you have the option of starting by seed or by transplant. Some things prefer to be started by seed, your root crops like your carrots, radishes, and turnips, as well as the larger seeded crops like cucumbers, squash, and beans. Other things are better to start as transplants like peppers, tomatoes, things that take a little bit longer to grow. And some things you can plant either way. Some of the benefits of planting by seed is that the seeds, you can find more variety, whether you're getting them from your local garden store or getting them from an online catalog. And you can also get them a lot cheaper. So it's the more affordable way to go that's going to give you more choices. Starting seeds by transplant, you'll be able to have a head start on your season. So as opposed to putting a seed in the ground and that taking a while to get started, this transplant is already ready to roll. And so it's going to give you a head start and give you a chance to grow things like peppers and tomatoes that take longer to grow and to get an earlier harvest. It will also give you a head start on weeds. So when we plant this pepper plant into the freshly prepared bed that doesn't have any weeds in it, it can get going and it will be able to start to establish a canopy of leaves that will help to shade out the weeds that would be coming behind it. When you're picking out transplants at a garden store or farmer's market, there's a couple of things you want to look out for. In general, you want to look for a transplant that looks really green and healthy overall. So you want to avoid plants that look kind of yellow or bug-eaten or have a lot of flowers or just look generally overgrown. Another thing to look out for on those plants that look a little bit overgrown is you might take a peek at their roots. This plant right here has a lot of roots all crunched together because it spent too much time in the pot and it's become root bound. This plant over here though, which looks beautiful and is a really nice size for planting in the ground, if I pull this out, it holds its root ball pretty well together, but those roots aren't all tightly clustered right at the bottom. This one is ready to put into the ground and hasn't grown too long in this pot. Another thing to consider when selecting transplants is you might be tempted when looking at 2 tomato plants like these here to go for the taller, bigger plant, thinking you'll get even bigger of a head start. But actually you want to go for the shorter, sturdier, stockier looking plant because that's actually the stronger plant. So it's going to get established more quickly and get growing more quickly and is less likely to blow over in a strong wind. If you want to have the affordability that comes with starting your plants from seed and also the greater options that you have that way, but you want to get a head start on the season by planting out transplants, you do have the option of buying seeds and starting your own transplants at home. To grow your own transplants at home, you'll need containers with drainage holes, potting mix, seeds, labeling materials, and a warm, sunny window or another warm, sunny, protected place where your plant flats can sit while they're sprouting and growing. It's important to use a potting mix that's nutrient-rich, fluffy, and well-draining instead of using soil from your garden. Soil from your garden doesn't have all those same properties, and so it will be harder to create the ideal conditions that you need for growing healthy transplants. But you're only going to be growing these plants until they're big enough to put out in the garden. So you don't need very big containers, and therefore you won't need a lot of potting mix. A little bit will go a long way. For the containers themselves, you can buy or reuse little seedling packs, or you can get creative with what you have at home. Egg cartons, Dixie cups, little yogurt containers, all of these will work just fine for seeding into as long as you put little holes in the bottom so that the water can drain through. Now we'll walk step by step through the process of starting your own transplants. For containers, I'm going to use these little yogurt containers and also an old seedling pack I have left over from last year. You can see that the seedling pack already has little holes in it. And for the yogurt container, I put holes into it using a little pair of scissors. Once you've got your containers with holes in them, you're ready to fill them. To fill them up, you're going to want to take your nice, fluffy, nutrient-rich potting mix, put it into the container, and then tap the container down a little bit to settle it in. If it settles down too far, go ahead and add some more potting mix into there, give it another tap so that you've got it nice and full. It can help even to give a little tap on the top, just to make sure that you've got a good amount of soil in there and there aren't too many air pockets. You want to make sure though that you're not pushing down too hard and compressing all of that important pore space in your soil. Because remember, the plants need that pore space in order for the air and the water to pass through the soil. Now that your containers are filled with potting mix, you're ready to make little holes for the seeds. For smaller seeds, you'll only need a small, shallow hole. For larger seeds, like cucumbers or squash, you'll want to make a deeper hole for them to go down into. As a general rule of thumb, it's good to make a hole that's about 2 times the size of the widest side of the seed itself, so that you make sure that it's deep enough down to have good coverage, but is still able to have access to the light it needs to grow. Once you've got your holes, you're ready to go ahead and put the seeds in. As a general rule of thumb, I like to put 2 seeds per hole. That way, if one of the seeds doesn't sprout, there's another seed in there and another chance for you to get a plant in that little container. Some seed packets will give you specific instructions on how many seeds to put in per hole or per container. Otherwise, 2 seeds per hole is a good rule of thumb to follow. Once you've got your seeds in the holes, go ahead and take a little bit of the potting mix and put it over the top of the seed, patting it down a little bit just so that that seed has good contact with the soil around it. Another important part of growing your own transplants at home is making sure to label them well. You'll want to label your plants with the crop that it is, the variety you're growing, and it's also helpful to put down the date. That way, if something doesn't sprout up after a week or so, you could go back and check and see how long does this plant usually take to germinate. If it takes usually just a few days and it hasn't sprouted up yet, then that's a good sign that you might need to reseed those containers. But if it takes something more like 2 weeks to germinate, then you know you still have a little bit more time for them to start to pop up. For the labels themselves, you can buy labels at the garden center, or you can just use things that you might find laying around your house, like popsicle sticks, or you could cut up old yogurt containers and use those, or even old blinds can be cut and turned into labels. Anything that you can write on easily with a permanent marker and stick down into the soil so that you make sure you know what you're growing. Once you've seeded your containers and made sure that they're well labeled, you're going to want to water them in using a watering can or a gentle shower or mist setting on your garden hose. It's really important in watering in seedling trays or new baby plants that you make sure not to use a really heavy water pressure, which is likely to shift the seed around in the soil or to damage the small growing plants. It's important to monitor your new seedlings daily and keep them well watered. Warmth and moisture are key to helping seeds germinate and to helping plants get off to a good start. Now that we've got these containers seeded, well labeled, and watered in, I'm going to put them in a sunny windowsill. If you have a south-facing window, this is the best place to put them, but anywhere where you get good sunlight throughout a good chunk of the day should be just fine. It's helpful to keep in mind that even if you're growing your transplants in a bright, sunny window, they're not going to look exactly like the ones that you would see at the farmer's market or at a garden center. They're apt to be a little bit more spindly, perhaps a little bit more leggy, because they haven't gotten the same full sun that those plants have gotten from growing inside a greenhouse. This isn't cause for great concern. They should still get off to a good start once you put them into the garden, and you will have saved a little bit of money in the process. Whether you are seeding into containers to grow your own transplants or getting ready to direct seed out into the garden bed, there are a few important things to keep in mind in order to get those seeds off to a great start. In the first class of this series, we talked about the 4 main elements that all things need to grow: light, water, air, and nutrients. If you're growing in a fluffy, nutrient-rich potting mix, and keeping your seedlings in a nice, sunny, well-ventilated part of your house, then you already have the light, the air, and the nutrients covered. The one thing that will take a little bit more effort to manage is the water or the moisture level. While all plants at all stages need water to survive, it's particularly important to monitor the water and to maintain moist soil when starting seeds. Moisture is critical for germination or sprouting of seeds and for keeping tender baby plants alive. We also are often starting our transplants in very small containers with relatively small amounts of potting mix, and so they are prone to drying out quicker than larger potted plants. In general, it's good to water your seedlings about once every day or once every other day, depending on where they are in your house and how much light, airflow, and heat is present. Speaking of heat, one final factor to consider in germinating seeds is temperature. Seeds will germinate at a variety of different ranges depending on the crop itself, but all crops have a specific ideal range that they germinate at. Refer to this chart, which is in Chapter 3 of your Seed to Supper manual, in order to see the minimum temperature that a variety of different crops need to germinate. There are other places where you can look to find the wider range that those crops need to germinate, including not just the minimum, but the maximum as well. The temperature that most people keep their houses at will work just fine for germinating most seeds, but it's still important to pay attention to that ideal range when thinking about where to put your seedlings in your house. For example, heat-loving tomatoes will want to be in a really sunny, warm place and not sitting next to a drafty window. When we seed or plant directly into the ground, into our garden beds, where we have less control over the soil temperature, it's still important to pay attention to that ideal temperature range for germination. By planting according to seasonal recommendations, we can make sure to get our plants into the ground when the soil temperature is right for them. But if in doubt, you can always go out and check the soil temperature with a kitchen thermometer. One of the places where you can find information about the germination requirements of the specific seeds you're trying to grow is on the seed packet themselves. Though they vary somewhat from company to company in exactly what information they provide, most seed packets will provide some basic information about when to plant, how far apart to plant, how deep to put your seeds, and more. All seed packets should tell you the name of the crop as well as the specific variety. Some will give a brief description of the specific variety, while others will just give basic planting and growing guidelines for all varieties of that crop. Some things to look for on the packet that can help to guide your planting include the date the seed was packed, which is helpful in making sure that your seeds aren't too old, the seed depth, the seed or plant spacing, the temperature requirements for germination, the days to germination or emergence, which is when your little seeds will sprout and first start to peek through the soil, the days to harvest, which is how many days it will take from when you put that seed or that transplant into the ground till when that crop is ready to harvest, when to start seeds in relation to your average last frost, and whether they are better started indoors as transplants or direct seeded into the garden. Some seeds require special treatments in order to aid germination, such as putting them in water in order to soak them and pre-sprout them, or putting them in the freezer in order to cold stratify them, which sounds fancy, but is basically just a way to trick your seeds into thinking that they've gone through a cold winter and now it's time to sprout. These types of special treatments or special instructions are another thing that you will find on some seed packets. Some seed companies do not put a lot of information on their packets, however, and might only have the name of the crop and the variety itself. If this is the case with your seed packet, you can find a lot of this information that we detailed here in the charts in your Seed to Supper manual, or you can go online to the company's website and look for the information there. You can buy seeds from your local garden center or hardware store, or for more variety, you can order directly from the seed companies themselves. If you're interested in ordering directly from the seed companies, you can request a free catalog or go online and browse to see what they have available. When you can, it's great to buy from local or regional seed suppliers. That way you can get seeds that are bred for the specific climate and conditions of the area you're growing in. Some great regional seed suppliers here in the Southeast are So True Seeds, Commonwealth Seed Growers, and Southern Exposure. For other good seed companies that are a little bit further afield, you might check out Johnny's, Territorial, or Baker Creek. When buying seeds, it's a good idea to order just enough for that year that you're going to plant them. The older seeds get, the less consistent their germination rate will be, which basically means that the percentage of seeds that will properly sprout is going to decrease a little bit year after year. That said, seeds will last about 2 to 5 years if stored properly. To store seeds, you want to keep them in a cool, dry, dark place, inside of a jar, a box, or some other sealed container. If you have leftover silica packets from a vitamin bottle or from shoes, you could put those inside the container as well in order to help minimize the moisture. Basically, what you're trying to do is to deprive the seeds of the conditions that they need to sprout and grow. So you want to make sure that they're not stored in a place where there's going to be a lot of light or moisture. If you have space in your freezer, that's another great place to put them. One reason to make sure that you're storing them in sealed containers is to prevent them from being eaten by critters like mice or insects that might find them yummy. Taking care not to buy too much more than what you need for one season and making sure to keep your seeds well stored will help to prevent waste and also to make sure that you have a good germination rate when you go to plant your garden next year. Thus far, we've talked about some of the basics of soil health and how you can assess your own soil and figure out what you need to do in order to build it up. Now that you've got all of that under your belt, we're ready to jump into talking about what to do to actually prepare your garden bed. Some of you will be working with existing beds, while others will need to be making a bed from scratch. We're going to talk about both of these processes, building a bed from scratch, but also preparing an existing bed that hasn't been used in a little while. We are going to show you one way to prepare a brand new bed, but we'll also show you what to do in order to prepare your existing bed. And you'll see that many of the same considerations and concepts apply in both situations. If you're working with an existing bed like this one here, the first step is going to be to remove all of the plant residue, all of the weeds, or maybe the old crop that was growing there before, in order to clear the bed and make it ready for the next crop to come. You can prepare your garden bed at any time of year, but a lot of folks will do this bed prep in the spring in preparation for the new season ahead. Once you've got all of the plant residue removed from your bed, it's time to apply some compost. We usually like to apply about 1/4 inch to 2 inches with every new season. For this bed here, I'm going to use 2 buckets of compost, just kind of scatter it across the top. This is also the time to apply your fertilizer, any amendments you know that your garden soil or the plants you're about to grow will need to help give them that extra boost. I'm going to add some feather meal to this bed. We already have enough potassium and enough phosphorus in it, especially with what the compost will add. So I'm just adding a little nitrogen boost, and it doesn't take much. Once you've got all of your amendments spread out, you can take a rake or a little hand cultivator and kind of smooth them across the bed to make sure that you've got a little bit more thorough coverage so that they're covering the entire surface of your bed. Once you've got your compost and your fertilizer evenly spread across the bed, then it's time to turn it into the soil. We want to incorporate that compost and that fertilizer deeper down into the soil so it's mixed throughout a greater area. To do that, you can use a shovel, a garden fork, or even a little hand trowel. I'm going to use this garden fork right here. And I'm just going to dig deep in, lift it up, and turn it over. This soil here is so loose that I could even get away without turning it over. I could just kind of wiggle it back and forth, and that compost and fertilizer is going to settle down into that deeper area of the soil, trying to get it mixed down in about 4 to 6 inches. The last step to do, once you've got all of the compost and the fertilizer incorporated in, is to go ahead and just rake the surface of your bed smooth. As you're doing this, you might find some little bits of weed that are still left or big chunks of root. You can go ahead and pull those out as you come to them. But otherwise, you're just aiming for a relatively smooth surface. Once the surface of your bed is smooth, you're ready to go ahead and start planting. One important thing to keep in mind, whether you're preparing an existing garden bed for a new crop or building a whole new bed from scratch, is that you want to be careful not to work in your soil when it's either too dry or too wet. Ideally, you want your soil, when you squeeze it together, to feel a little bit like a wrung out sponge, so that you might feel a little bit of moisture, you might hear a little bit of moisture if you squeeze it up near your ear, but you won't see any water droplets dropping out. If water does come out, that means that the soil is too wet, and it's better to wait until it's dried out a bit to work with it. Otherwise, you risk compacting the soil by working in it when it's too wet. This soil right here is actually a little bit too dry. You can see it just kind of crumbles in my hand. Ideally, we would have watered this bed a little bit before working in it and then maybe waited a day and worked in it after that. So it's just an important thing to think about, is trying to get in there when the soil is at that kind of ideal midpoint and not too wet or too dry. For those of you who are just getting started on a brand new garden bed, one of the first things to consider is the size of the bed that you're going to build, and if you haven't already thought about it, the location where it will be. An important thing to keep in mind is some of those factors that we talked about in class 1 in terms of what sort of time you have to work with, what sort of space you have available in your yard, and also what your experience level is. You don't necessarily want to jump into a really big garden if it's your first season growing. Another piece to keep in mind is how the size of the bed is going to feel for your own body in working it. You want the size of the bed to kind of fit the dimensions of your body or of the bodies of other people who are going to be working in it, so that when you reach across the bed, you can comfortably reach to the middle of the bed without straining your back or without having to step into the soil if it's an in-ground bed. This way, you won't make yourself uncomfortable when you're doing the work later on. A common size for the width of a bed is 3 to 4 feet because most people can reach comfortably to the middle of that without straining too much. However, if your bed is going to be located right up against a building or a fence line where you can only access it from one side, it's better to have it a little bit narrower, maybe 1.5 to 2 feet, so you can easily reach all the way to the other side. Now that we've talked a little bit about how to prepare an existing garden bed, we're going to look at how to build a brand new bed from scratch. One way that you can do that is building a bed like this. That's a raised bed box, which is really nice if you don't want to have to bend over too much to do the work. But what we're going to show you is a type of bed that takes a little bit less resources, less materials, and is a little bit more straightforward to prepare. So let's head over to Jacob and look at how to make that brand new garden bed.
So now we're going to build a simple raised garden bed. We're here in just a basic patch of turf that might look a lot like your own yard, and so we're going to show you how to break it up and get started with your own garden bed. If you want to know other ways to build a basic raised bed, check out your Seed to Supper manual or take a look online. So we've now measured out the space we're going to work in. This is about 3 feet by 6 feet. It's a nice place to start for any home gardener. We're going to work in this patch I'm standing in as our bed, and just to my left is going to be where the pathway is. So first we're going to break up the soil. I'm going to use my shovel. You could also use a mattock or a hoe or anything else you have to dig into the soil. But what I want to do is remove the grass. The grass is an aggressive plant that will make it difficult for your garden to grow. So I'm going to lift up this first chunk of grass and show you all that there's a lot of soil in here. So we don't want to throw it all out because the soil's good. You can even see it's nice and dark. It's got some health and nutrition in here. So I'm going to shake the soil off, trying to leave as much as I can in my bed. And now we have mostly just grass and grass roots. So this is what we want to get rid of. Probably not throw in our compost pile because it might regrow. We might just put this out with the green garden waste. From here, I'm going to continue to dig out the rest of my bed. It's easy to work off of the first hole that you dug, pushing the soil and the plants towards that hole. This way you're not fighting a new piece of ground that hasn't been loosened yet. So I'm going to pull out this next chunk, keep beating off the soil, making sure that I leave as much in the bed as possible. And throwing the grass out, we're going to work this entire bed up until we have a nice, loose garden bed. So now we've got our last little bit of grass out. We've got our whole bed cleared of once living things. Remember to try to get everything out by the root as best you can to give your next set of plants the best chance possible. I haven't added any fertilizer to this bed because I haven't got my soil test back yet. So instead of adding anything now, I'm just going to add compost to help build the healthy living material in the soil and hold off on fertilizer until I get my soil test result. Shooting for about 2 to 3 inches for the whole space. I'm going to use this whole wheelbarrow load and dump it right on in and spread it out over the whole bed right now. Doesn't need to be pretty, just need to get a nice healthy layer of compost in here to get ourselves started for the year. So I'll take my rake or any other spreading tool like a shovel or trowels. I'm going to spread the compost over the whole space of my bed. Again, it doesn't need to be pretty, just need to spread it out so it's even, because we're going to add a little bit more soil to this to really make it a truly raised bed. Yeah, that'll work just perfect. I can see that there's about 2, maybe even 3 inches of compost all the way down here touching the soil. So now we're going to clear out this grass so we can build our path out correctly. Like I said, we'll throw this grass in our green waste because it can't really be composted well in case the weed roots or rhizomes decide to resprout and we have a whole weedy mess on our hands. But now I want to clear this space out about 2 feet worth next to my garden bed to create a nice path. Move my my wheelbarrow out of the way and dig this section out right here. Do the exact same thing we did before. First by cutting a little hole in, removing a chunk of grass, trying to save as much soil as we can, because we want all the soil to actually end up in the bed itself instead of the pathway. This time, if you have any extra soil, you can knock it off right into the bed itself, because we ultimately want to have all the soil in this space. I'll throw these right into my wheelbarrow and keep working all the way down this whole pathway. With our last shovelful of grass here, and throw the rest of that soil off, get rid of our grass. Now we're going to scrape the path here and get a little bit of extra soil onto our raised bed. We're going to dig down about 6 to 8 inches so that the bed is a good bit higher than the path itself. So just going to throw a little bit of soil all the way across the whole bed so that I have a nice clear bed and nice clear paths. Now let's get the other side done as well. So now that we've got our last little bit of pathway scraped onto the top of our bed, we're going to just mix it all up. We want to mix the compost and the soil that we dumped on so that we have a good, loose garden bed for our next set of crops. It's useful to use your shovel or your digging fork or any similar tool so that you can get as deep as you can go and really loosen just everything up, breaking up any clods of dirt, pulling out any extra roots or grass or even garbage you might find in your bed, and making sure that the bed is nice and crumbly for our first garden crop. Now that we've got the bed all nice and loosened up, to our final bed preparation step, breaking it smooth. And again, pulling out any little bits of garbage or big rocks and bricks or little bits of living things right out of the soil. Once we finish this step, we're going to be at a final stage of bed preparation. This means that once we get a good, clean bed full of healthy living soil and free of other dead or decaying plants, at this point we have a beautiful garden bed ready for planting. Now that our garden bed is all ready for planting, it's time to put our seeds in the ground. Whenever we just put a seed out into your garden bed, we call that direct seeding or direct sowing. There are three main types of direct seeding: straight rows, broadcasting, and hilling or mounding. Remember, whenever we're planting a seed straight into the soil, we always want to put it about twice the depth of the length of the longest part of that seed. But oftentimes you can just follow the instructions that are on your seed packet, and that'll take care of you. Also, we want to overseed or plant more seeds than is necessary for the ultimate amount of plants we want out in your garden, in case birds, bugs, or even bad weather keeps those seeds from germinating. Most seed packets describe planting in a long, straight row with space between the plants and space between the rows. To begin with, you can draw your own line in the soil or lay out strings to help you get a nice straight row. You can draw a line in the soil making a furrow, which is basically just like a shallow trench for things like carrots, which can be planted a little bit closer together, or just individual holes that you lay out with a ruler or tape measure for crops that could use a little bit more space, like cucumbers or squash. As you're seeding, make sure to leave your seeds uncovered before you finish a row, because it's really easy to forget where you're at. So once you've put all the seeds in the furrow or holes, cover it up lightly with soil and then tamp it down nicely so there's good contact between the seed and the soil. And remember, it's really important to keep those rows good and straight and not whopper-jawed, otherwise it can be challenging later down the line to weed or even put supports up in case they need to climb up something. Broadcasting is a direct sowing method where we spread out seed over the whole soil surface. This is a great strategy for crops like root veggies, baby greens, and cover crops because it very quickly and efficiently can cover a large area. But you have to be careful to ensure that you still maintain the proper distance between each crop by using the right amount of seed to the amount of space. To set this up, you can either outline an area with strings and stakes or just draw lines in the soil. Carefully take the seeds and spread them out over the soil area, either lightly tossing them over the soil or dropping them at those specific increments between each seed. Then you can come back with some soil and lightly cover all those seeds or even indent them into the soil with your fingers. Be sure to work from one side to the next so that you don't forget what seeds have already been covered. Broadcasting is a great way to put a lot of seeds out in your soil, but it can definitely be a bit of a challenge to weed because when all the plants sprout, it can be difficult to determine what's a crop you care about and which one's just a weed. Some larger crops benefit from being planted in mounds, such as cucumbers, watermelons, and winter squash. This helps ensure proper spacing in between some of these larger plants. To make a mound, simply pull a little bit of soil into a small pile. Place a few holes in the top of that pile and drop seeds into the top of the mound, maybe 3 to 5 seeds per mound. Once the seeds have begun to sprout, leave just the strongest seedling and pull out all the smaller ones, allowing the biggest, strongest plant to survive to maturity. No matter where you plant your seed, whether it's directly in the field or preparing for a transplant, it's really important to learn the skill of thinning. Thinning is all about removing extra plants that are growing too close together and will cause one or both of the plants to not grow to their full size, maturity, and health. Oftentimes, we'll thin plants that are sown directly in the field, things like carrots, radishes, and other plants that will often overseed, because remember, it's important to overseed to ensure we get a good stand of that plant. However, right now, just for the sake of example, we're going to take a look at this tray of collard greens and thin them out according to what we need here. In this space, I have these different cells, and we want each plant to be standalone. We just want one plant per cell. In the field, however, you need to reference your seed planting charts or the seed packets themselves to understand how far apart you need to thin the plants to. Oftentimes, it's between 1 to about 3 inches depending on the plant. To actually do the physical act of thinning, the important thing is just to lightly pull the plant that's extra out of the ground or the cell. So right here, I have 2 collard greens. They look about the same, so maybe I'll pull this one right here that's a little bit smaller. All I'm going to do is lightly tug it out of the soil, and there we go. It pulled out, it didn't disrupt the other plant itself. It still looks like it's strongly embedded in the soil. And with this extra one, unfortunately, we have to get rid of it and throw it away. I know it's really hard for gardeners to do this because you spent all this time and energy making sure that you have a healthy, thriving plant come up. But again, at the end of the day, thinning is a really important skill to not only ensure the plant gets to full maturity but stays healthy. And one bonus is oftentimes the little things that you thin make a great snack. Now that we've talked about seeds and transplants, it's time to bring them out and put them in the garden. You might remember from our second class, if you've established a new garden bed or are returning to an old one, that our final step is to loosen the soil and prepare it for those plants to go in. So just want to quickly remind you that we want to either break up any remaining clods of soil as we prepare the seed bed, and then finally rake it out, make it nice and smooth and prepared for whatever plant goes in next. You can use your little hand cultivator, or we can get out our rake and we can smooth out the soil surface as our final step before we begin to plant. Once the bed is nice and smooth, we're ready to plant. Now that we've chosen healthy, strong transplants, it's time to put them out in the garden. The first thing you want to think about is the time of day. So we don't want to choose the hottest time of day to put out your transplants. Ideally the morning or the late evening is good because you don't want them to dry out too much and have too much shock or stress from the transplanting. Also, a cloudy day can be really helpful for this, or even a day with a light rain or one that has rain predicted can be really helpful. It's also important to avoid a really windy day because for the same reason as the sun, you can really dry out your transplants. Now that we're beginning to lay out our garden bed, we don't want our plants to be too close or too far apart. If they're too close together, remember that they will be overgrown and can limit how big the plants get and how healthy they are. But likewise, if they're too far apart, you have all this wasted space that you worked so hard to prepare. So now let's measure out our space. So I'm going to start on this far end with my tape measure, measuring all the way across the garden bed, measuring every 18 inches is where I'm going to put my pepper plant. Before that, I want to also know how many rows of peppers I'm going to do. Because I know that this bed is about 4 feet wide, I'm going to only do 2 rows of peppers to make sure they have enough space. So now I'm going to lay out the tape measure, starting on this far end and move all the way down. I'm going to dig all my holes so that I know the proper spacing before I fill them back in, and I can make any changes as needed. So I'm going to first start 18 inches off the wall of the garden bed right here, and dig the hole about the depth of the soil for the plant. So here it's going to be about 2 to 3 inches. So I'll just dig a quick hole right here at 18 inches, then jump another 18 inches to 36 inches, and dig another hole. I'm going to do this down the whole length of the garden bed for my first row and then for my second row. Now that I've got my last hole dug, I'm going to switch over to the other side. I'm going to use my tape measure again, but I'm not going to actually use it for the measurements. Instead, I'm going to use it just as a straight line. What I'm going to do to measure the holes and where they are in relationship to the other ones is do them in opposite. So instead of drawing the hole straight across here, I'm going to go in between each existing hole to really maximize the amount of space in between each plant. So I'll lay out my tape measure so that I have a nice straight line to go off of. And now I'm going to dig my holes just opposite or in between each of the pre-existing holes. Now that we have all of our holes dug in the proper spacing, it's time to get our plants out. So a couple things to remember here. Sometimes when you order plants from garden stores or online, there will be a couple of different plants in the same cell. It's important to try to only have one plant in each hole. So if you can carefully remove them from one another, that can work. But if they're really tightly bound together at the roots, you can just snip one off and keep the strongest one. Here, since we seeded these ourselves, they're all individual plants in their own cell. So to get the plant out of its cell pack here, or the cells being this little container right here, what I'll first do is begin to squeeze the bottom, actually, where the root's living. After I've squeezed it a little bit, I can start to pull up right at the base where it's strongest out of the pack, and voila, it came out. Sometimes though, they can be a little bit sticky and kind of stuck in there. So if you're having a hard time, keep squeezing the sides, or you can take a pencil or a Sharpie and actually find the hole that's on the bottom of the cell pack and just give it a little poke. Sometimes that can be enough to get it out of the tray. So now I've got a nice, healthy looking plant. I'm going to take it over to my first hole I dug, pop it right on in there. If the roots have a little bit of what we call root boundness, they're kind of spun around, we can break them up just a little bit to kind of let the root hairs continue to grow out of the plant itself. So I'm going to place it in the hole. I'm going to bring the soil all the way around it, just sparing a little bit of the stem of the plant, and then compacting it just a bit. Remember, we don't need to smash it down in there, but you just want to get it nice and firm in the soil so that when rain comes and you water it, it doesn't get knocked around every which way. As well as the soil compacts a little bit, it can kind of sink a bit. So having a small mound of soil right around the top, just like that, can be helpful for giving your transplants a good healthy start. Then we're going to take the rest of the plants and we're going to take them and put them in each of the holes, filling out our whole bed. Good. Now that we've got our whole bed planted out, it's time to make sure we water in all of our plants. First, I'm going to bring back this irrigation line we have for these garden beds, and then we'll water each one by hand. It's really important to remember to water right away on a warm day, but really any day, to ensure that your plants don't wilt and have a harsh start to their new life. So I'm going to take my watering can and be very careful to water each and every plant, not touching the leaves too much, but we'll get into the watering and some specifics around watering in our next chapter. I'm going to make sure each plant gets a nice dose of water, and I might come back to them a couple times to make sure each and every plant is well watered before I'm done for the day. So I'm going to let those soak in for a moment. I'm going to pull up my label. It's really important to remember to label all of your plants that you put in the garden. Because these are all the same variety of pepper, we only need one label, but it's really important whether you put a transplant or a seed in the ground to put a label in so you don't forget where it is, what it is, and ideally when you put it in the ground. This can be helpful for determining when you should expect a fruit or when to harvest it. So a carrot, it's important to know when it was planted so that you don't forget, oh, it's time to harvest these carrots. So I'm going to make sure I put a label in next to my plant after it's well watered in. I'm going to finish watering now that the water's soaked in a bit. Good seed and strong transplants is the best way to start a healthy garden. However, that's just the beginning of our journey. In the next class, we're going to talk about how to maintain those healthy plants all the way to harvest.